A ruthless biker gang burned down her son's business, destroyed her home, but they messed with the wrong woman. This isn't just an old veteran. She's a warrior with nothing left to lose. What happens when fear meets someone who's not afraid to fight back? Watch as she rallies her old war comrades, exposes dark secrets, and leads a rebellion that shakes the town to its core. Stay tuned, because this is more than revenge. It's war. Chapter 1: Shadows in Timberbrook. Timberbrook was not a place that welcomed everyone. The small southern town was steeped in the weight of history, its streets filled with the echoes of unspoken prejudices. For decades, the community's power dynamics were as unyielding as the sun-baked asphalt that lined Main Street. White-owned businesses thrived in the heart of town, while the few black families who lived in Timberbrook were relegated to its outskirts, confined to neighborhoods marked by deteriorating houses and overgrown lawns. Here, opportunity was scarce, and dreams often withered before they could take root. Dominating this fragile balance of power was Iron Fangs, a notorious motorcycle gang. Their roaring engines could be heard across Timberbrook as they patrolled the streets, a constant reminder of their influence. The gang operated under a banner of terror, collecting protection money from businesses and targeting anyone who dared challenge their authority. Their presence was a festering wound in Timberbrook's soul, and nowhere was this wound felt more keenly than by its black residents. Eleanor Ellie Carter had long learned how to navigate life in Timberbrook. At 62, she was a woman of quiet resilience, living alone in a modest house on the edge of town. Her house stood as a metaphor for her life, strong in structure but weathered by time and neglect. She had chosen to keep her interactions with her neighbors minimal. Decades of judgmental stares and curt conversations had taught her that sometimes silence was the easiest way to endure. Inside her home, Ellie moved with the deliberation of someone accustomed to living in solitude. Her most prized possession was a small photo frame on the mantel, holding a picture of her younger self. Dressed in a military uniform, she stood tall beside a helicopter during her time as a medic in the Gulf War. The image captured a woman who had saved lives under fire, whose bravery had been forged in the crucible of combat. Yet here in Timberbrook, that strength often went unacknowledged. To the townsfolk, she was simply an old black woman who kept to herself. Ellie would sometimes sit with the photo in hand, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame as memories of her service flickered to life. Those memories were a stark contrast to her current reality. Back then, she had been respected by her comrades, even if she had to fight harder than most to earn it. Now in Timberbrook, she was reduced to a figure barely worthy of a nod of acknowledgement. Ellie's quiet existence changed when her son, Marcus, returned home. A recent college graduate, Marcus carried with him an optimistic vision for a better future, both for himself and for his mother. He was determined to make his mark in Timberbrook and show the town that change was not only possible, but necessary. "Mom, I've been thinking," Marcus said one afternoon as they sat on her porch. "I want to open a restaurant. Something small, but something ours. I'll call it Marcus, Southern Kitchen. Imagine it. Homemade fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, everything people love around here." Ellie looked at her son, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Marcus, you know how this town is. They're not going to make it easy for you." "I know, Mom, but we can't keep letting them tell us where we belong. If we don't push back, nothing will ever change." Ellie admired her son's determination, though she feared for what it might cost him. Timberbrook was a place where ambition often clashed with prejudice, and the latter usually won. Despite Ellie's concerns, Marcus threw himself into his dream. He leased a small storefront on the outskirts of Main Street, far enough from the heart of town to feel safe but close enough to attract customers. Over the next few weeks, he transformed the space into a warm and welcoming eatery. The walls were decorated with family photos, old cookbooks, and vibrant posters celebrating Black culture. A small sign above the door proudly bore the name Marcus's Southern Kitchen. Opening day was a modest success. Friends from their neighborhood came to support Marcus, and even a few curious townsfolk stopped by to sample the food. Marcus beamed as he served plates of fried chicken and mac and cheese, his dream finally taking shape. Ellie watched from the corner, her heart swelling with pride and unease in equal measure. It didn't take long for the success of Marcus' venture to draw unwanted attention. One evening, as Marcus was locking up the restaurant, the low rumble of motorcycles filled the air. 4 members of Iron Fangs pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the dim light of the street lamps. Their leader, a burly man with a jagged scar running across his cheek, dismounted and approached Marcus. "Nice place you got here," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "We like to take care of businesses in this town. Make sure nothing bad happens to them." Marcus understood the implication immediately. "I don't need your protection," he replied, his voice steady but his hands tightening into fists. The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "That's what they all say, but you'll come around. They always do." With that, the gang mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, leaving Marcus standing in the glow of his restaurant sign, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. Marcus didn't tell Ellie about the encounter, not wanting to worry her, but Ellie, ever perceptive, sensed that something was wrong. She decided to keep a close eye on the restaurant, visiting frequently and offering her help wherever she could. One night, Marcus returned home late, exhaustion etched into his face. Ellie was waiting for him on the porch. Before she could ask how his day had gone, the distant wail of a fire truck's siren shattered the quiet. A plume of black smoke was rising in the direction of Marcus's restaurant. They rushed to the scene, their worst fears confirmed. Flames consumed the building as firefighters battled to control the inferno. The smell of burning wood and grease filled the air, and the sound of crackling flames drowned out the murmurs of the gathered crowd. Ellie and Marcus stood frozen as they watched their dream collapse into ash. On one of the remaining walls, scorched but still visible, were the words "Stay in your place," scrawled in spray paint. As the fire died down, Marcus turned to his mother, his face a mask of despair. "Why, Mom? Why do they hate us so much? I just wanted to build something good." Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes locked onto the smoldering ruins. "Because they're afraid," she said quietly, "afraid of what it means when we succeed. But this isn't the end. Not for us." That night, as they sat in silence on Ellie's porch, the weight of the fire hung heavy between them. But beneath the sorrow, a spark of resolve began to take hold in Ellie. She knew that Timberbrook needed more than dreams. It needed action. Chapter 2: Ashes and Anger. The acrid smell of charred wood lingered in the air as Ellie and Marcus stood motionless before what remained of Marcus's dream. The once vibrant Marcus's southern kitchen, adorned with family photos and memories of their heritage, was now a blackened skeleton. Ashes blanketed the ground where customers had once gathered, and the words "Stay in your place," scrawled in jagged burnt graffiti, mocked them from the scorched walls. Marcus clenched his fists, his breath ragged with rage. "I should have known this would happen," he spat. "This town doesn't want us here. They never did." Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calm but heavy with sorrow. "This isn't your fault," she said. "Their hate has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their fear. They see what you're building and what it represents, and they can't stand it." Marcus shook his head, stepping away from her touch. "It doesn't matter. What's the point, Mom? Why stay here, where we'll always be seen as less than them? They'll burn down every dream we try to build." Ellie studied him, her heart breaking at the despair etched into his face. "If we leave, Marcus, then they win," she said softly. "And it won't just be us. Every black family in this town will see what happened here and feel like they don't stand a chance. Someone has to stand up to them. Someone has to show them we're not afraid." Marcus laughed bitterly. "And that someone is supposed to be us?" He gestured toward the ruins. "They've already taken everything. What's left to fight with?" Ellie didn't have an answer, not yet, but as she looked at the smoldering remains of the restaurant, she felt a flicker of resolve. This wasn't the first time she'd faced an enemy determined to break her spirit. That night, Ellie sat alone on the porch while Marcus paced inside the house. The creak of the rocking chair was the only sound, her thoughts drifting back to another time, another battle. She hadn't thought about the Gulf War in years, had buried it under the daily grind of life in Timberbrook. But the memories surged back, vivid and raw. She saw herself as a young woman, standing beside her helicopter under the blistering desert sun. She'd been one of the few black medics in her unit, and one of even fewer women. It hadn't taken long for her to realize that the battlefield wasn't her only enemy. The dismissive sneers, the muttered slurs, the constant need to prove herself, it had all been a war within a war. But Ellie had fought, not with fists or anger, but with an unshakable resolve to show them she was more than their prejudices. There had been allies too, men and women who had stood by her, who had recognized her skill and courage. She thought of Sam Hayes, who had once risked his life to shield her from enemy fire. Of Debbie Johnson, her closest friend in the unit, whose laughter had kept them sane during the darkest nights. And of Richie Porter, a white soldier who had defied his own upbringing to become one of her fiercest defenders. Those bonds had saved her then. Maybe, just maybe, they could save her now. The next morning, Marcus found Ellie at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in her hand and a distant look in her eyes. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I was thinking," she replied, "about what we do next." Marcus pulled out a chair sitting across from her. "What do you mean, next?" "There's nothing left, Mom. We can't rebuild. Even if we could, they'd just tear it down again." Ellie leaned forward, her voice steady. "Then we don't rebuild alone. I've been through this kind of fight before, Marcus, and I wasn't alone then either." Marcus frowned, unsure of what she meant. Ellie reached for a small wooden box she'd placed on the table. Inside were letters, photos, and a worn address book. "This is from my time in the service," she explained. "I kept in touch with some of the people I served with. At least I tried to. If they're still out there, maybe they can help." "Help with what?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "This isn't a war zone, Mom. This is Timberbrook." Ellie's eyes met his, unwavering. "It's more of a war zone than you think. And if we don't start treating it like one, we're going to lose." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe his mother, but the hopelessness of their situation was hard to ignore. Still, he couldn't deny the fire in her eyes. A fire that had refused to be extinguished, even in the face of everything they'd lost. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Ellie pulled out the address book, flipping through its yellowed pages. "I'm going to call some old friends." Later that afternoon, Ellie drove into town to pick up a few essentials. She'd avoided the main streets, choosing instead to stick to the quieter back roads. But even here, the atmosphere was tense. People stopped and stared as she passed, their expressions ranging from indifference to outright hostility. When she arrived at the small grocery store, the unease only deepened. The owner, a wiry man in his 50s named Clyde, was standing behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He barely looked up when she walked in, but the other customers did. Ellie could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers as they murmured to each other. "Isn't that the woman from the fire? Yeah. She should have known better than to start something. She needs to leave before she causes more trouble." Ellie kept her head high, moving through the aisles with purpose. She grabbed what she needed, flour, sugar, a few cans of vegetables, and placed them on the counter. Clyde finally glanced up, his lip curling in distaste. "You buying or just browsing?" he asked. Ellie ignored the jab, pulling out her wallet. "Just these," she said calmly. Clyde scanned the items, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finished, he leaned across the counter, his voice low. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "People around here don't take kindly to folks stirring up trouble." Ellie met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Trouble has a way of finding you, whether you're looking for it or not." Clyde sneered, shoving the bag of groceries toward her. "Suit yourself," he muttered, "but don't say I didn't warn you." Ellie didn't respond. She picked up the bag and walked out, her back straight despite the weight of the stairs that followed her. When she returned home, Marcus was waiting for her on the porch. "How'd it go?" he asked. "About how you'd expect," Ellie replied, setting the groceries down. "But I'm not worried about them. They're not the ones we need to focus on." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then who are we focusing on?" Ellie opened the door, gesturing for him to follow. "Come inside," she said. "It's time we had a strategy." That night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with her address book and a notebook in front of her. The phone sat beside her, its cord coiled tightly like a snake ready to strike. One by one, she dialed the numbers she had written down so many years ago. Some lines were disconnected, their owners lost to time. Others rang endlessly with no answer. But then a voice on the other end of the line. Familiar, warm, and unmistakably Sam Hayes. "Ellie Carter," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I never thought I'd hear from you again." Ellie smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Sam," she said, "it's been a long time." "Too long," he agreed. "What's going on? You don't call out of the blue for nothing." Ellie took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I need your help, Sam. It's a long story, but it starts with a gang called Fangs." As she explained the situation, Ellie felt a spark of hope reignite. She didn't know how many of her old friends would answer her call, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to fight this battle alone. Chapter 3. Calling the Past to Fight the Present. The next morning, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, her fingers drumming lightly on the worn wooden surface. The yellowed pages of her address book lay open before her, the names and numbers blurring together as she stared at them. A single name was already crossed out, a phone line disconnected, another ally lost to time. But she refused to be deterred. Somewhere in those pages were people who had once stood beside her in the heat of battle, people who had faced adversity and come out stronger for it. She just needed them to answer. The first voice she heard was Sam Hayes. His warm, familiar tone brought a fleeting smile to Ellie's face, a brief reprieve from the weight that hung over her. Sam had always been dependable, a man of action and conviction. When she told him about Timberbrook, about Marcus, and about the Iron Fangs, there was no hesitation in his response. "Say no more, Ellie," he said. "I'll be there as soon as I can. You need me. I'm coming." Hearing his words was like breathing fresh air for the first time in weeks. Ellie thanked him and moved on to the next name, Debbie Johnson. Debbie's voice, sharp and vibrant, had lost none of its energy despite the years that had passed. She didn't wait for Ellie to finish explaining before cutting her off. "You think I'd leave you hanging?" "Hell no, Ellie. I'll pack my bags tonight." Ellie felt her confidence grow with each call. Richie Porter was the last name she dialed that morning, her fingers hesitating briefly over the keypad. Richie had been a surprising ally during their time in the Gulf War. He was a white man raised in a family that had taught him to distrust people like Ellie, but the battlefield had shown him another side of humanity. Richie had stood up for Ellie when few others would, and she hadn't forgotten that. When he answered, his voice was gruff but familiar. "Ellie Carter," he said, his tone laced with surprise. "Never thought I'd hear from you again." Ellie chuckled softly. "Didn't think I'd have to call, Richie. But here we are. I need your help." Richie listened in silence as Ellie laid out the situation. When she finished, there was a brief pause before he spoke. "You've always been a fighter, Ellie," he said. "If you're going up against these bastards, then I'm with you. Just tell me where to be." 3 days later, Ellie stood on her front porch, watching the familiar rumble of Sam Hayes' old pickup truck as it rolled down the dirt road toward her house. He climbed out, his frame as broad and solid as she remembered, and swept her into a bear hug before she could say a word. "Damn, it's good to see you, Ellie," he said, grinning. "Now let's get to work." Debbie arrived shortly after, her fiery red hair and confident stride turning heads even in a town like Timberbrook. "You've got me for as long as you need," she told Ellie, slinging her duffel bag over one shoulder. "Let's show these jerks what happens when they mess with the wrong people." Richie came last, his old motorcycle kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled into the driveway. He dismounted with practiced ease, his leather jacket and worn boots a stark contrast to the pristine uniforms Ellie remembered. But his steady eyes and firm handshake told her everything she needed to know. He was still the same Richie, still the man who had fought by her side when it mattered most. The four of them gathered in Ellie's small living room that evening, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Marcus sat nearby, watching with a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they swapped stories from their time in the service. It was clear to him that these people had been through hell together, but he wasn't sure how that would help them in Timberbrook. "We need a plan," Ellie said. pulling their focus back to the present. This isn't just about standing up to the Iron Fangs. It's about showing this town that they don't have to live in fear. Richie leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You've got your work cut out for you, Ellie. Gangs like this thrive on intimidation. If we're going to take them down, we need to hit them where it hurts. Exactly, Sam agreed. But we can't just go in swinging. We need information. We need to know how they operate, who they're working with, and what their weaknesses are. Debbie nodded. And we need the town on our side. If we're going to make this stick, people need to see what's really going on. Otherwise, the Iron Fangs will just come back stronger. Ellie listened carefully, her mind already working through the details. I've got a contact at the local church, she said. It's one of the few places where people feel safe enough to talk. If we can get them to open up, we might be able to piece together a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. Over the next few days, the group set to work. Richie used his mechanical skills to repair Ellie's aging truck, ensuring they had reliable transportation for their efforts. Sam and Marcus began mapping out the town, marking potential hotspots where the Iron Fangs might be conducting their operations. Debbie worked behind the scenes, setting up a basic communication system that would allow them to stay in contact without drawing attention. Ellie spent her time visiting the church and speaking with its congregation. At first, the responses were hesitant, the fear of retaliation evident in their voices. But as Ellie shared her own story, of Marcus's restaurant, of the fire, and of the friends who had come to help, she began to see a shift. People who had been silent for years started to speak up, their anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. One woman, an elderly black widow named Mrs. Turner, recounted how the Iron Fangs had extorted money from her late husband's business until it collapsed. A young man, barely out of his teens, admitted he'd been pressured into running errands for the gang and didn't know how to get out. Their stories painted a picture of a town suffocating under the Iron Fangs' grip, but they also revealed potential cracks in the gang's armor. As the pieces came together, Ellie and her team began to see a path forward. The Iron Fangs were more than just a gang. They were part of a larger network involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. Their operations relied on a few key locations, including a warehouse on the outskirts of town and a bar that served as their unofficial headquarters. We take those out, Sam said, pointing to the map they'd laid out on Ellie's dining table, and we cut them off at the knees. It's not just about taking them out, Ellie replied. We need to expose them. People need to see who they really are and what they've been doing to this town. Richie nodded. We can do that, but it's going to take more than just us. We need to get the people of Timberbrook on board. That evening, Ellie called another meeting at the church, this time inviting not just the congregation but anyone willing to listen. The turnout was larger than she'd expected, a mix of black and white faces filling the pews. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of desperation. But all of them were tired of living in fear, tired of the Iron Fangs, tired of the status quo. Ellie stood at the front of the room, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. I know what you're feeling, she said. I've felt it too. The fear, the anger, the hopelessness. But we don't have to live like this. We don't have to let them control us. Together we can fight back. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly a hand went up. It was Mrs. Turner. I'll help, she said. Whatever you need, I'll do it. One by one, others began to speak up. A young mechanic offered to keep an eye on the gang's vehicles. A local teacher volunteered to spread the word among her students. Even the bartender from the Iron Fangs headquarters agreed to share what he knew. By the time the meeting ended, Ellie felt a renewed sense of hope. Timberbrook wasn't broken, not yet, and with the help of her friends and neighbors, she was determined to save it. Chapter 4. Voices of the Voiceless. The small church in Timberbrook stood like a defiant sentinel against the gloom that enveloped the town. Its weathered exterior bore the marks of time, and though the paint had begun to peel, the bell tower still stretched toward the heavens, offering a glimmer of hope. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, thick with anticipation and uncertainty. Ellie Carter stood at the front of the sanctuary, her hands resting on the wooden lectern. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. Tonight would be a turning point, one way or another. The pews were packed, a rare sight for Timberbrook's modest church. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously as they waited for Ellie to speak. Many of them were black residents who had suffered in silence for years, afraid to raise their voices against the Iron Fangs. Sprinkled among them were a few white townsfolk, their expressions ranging from wary curiosity to open skepticism. Ellie could feel their doubt, their reluctance to believe that change was possible. But she also saw something else, something deeper. There was a flicker of hope buried beneath layers of fear and resignation. Ellie glanced at Marcus, who stood by the wall, arms crossed and face set in determination. Nearby, her three old comrades, Sam, Debbie, and Richie, waited silently, their presence a quiet reassurance. Ellie drew a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know it's not easy to be here. For some of you, this might feel like a risk, like stepping out into the open after years of hiding. But that's exactly why we're here tonight. Because hiding hasn't worked. Silence hasn't protected us. And if we keep living in fear, nothing will ever change." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was silent. Then a voice broke the stillness. "And what exactly do you think is going to change?" It came from a man sitting near the back, his arms crossed and his tone skeptical. "You think a few speeches are going to scare off the Iron Fangs? They've been running this town for years. You think they're just going to pack up and leave because you asked nicely?" Ellie met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "No," she said simply. "I don't expect them to leave quietly. But I do expect this town to stop making it so easy for them. The Iron Fangs thrive because they've convinced us that we're powerless. They've used fear to keep us divided. But we're not powerless, and we're not alone." Ellie's words sparked murmurs throughout the congregation, a ripple of uncertainty mixed with cautious agreement. She pressed on, her voice rising with emotion. "When I was in the Gulf War, I learned something about fear. Fear is like a shadow. It grows bigger when you try to run from it. But when you turn around and face it, you see it for what it really is. Empty. The Iron Fangs want us to believe they're invincible, but they're not. They're just men. Men who've gotten away with too much for too long." As Ellie spoke, members of the audience began to nod, their expressions shifting. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "My brother used to work at that bar they run," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me they're into some bad stuff. Drugs, money laundering. He wanted to get out, but they wouldn't let him." Another voice chimed in from the middle of the room. "They burned down my cousin's store last year. Told him it was an accident. But we all knew what it was. They wanted him gone." One by one, people began to share their stories. A man spoke of losing his job after refusing to pay the gang's protection fees. A mother recounted how her teenage son had been recruited to run errands for the Fangs, only to disappear for weeks at a time. Each story added weight to the growing sense of injustice in the room, until the collective anger was almost palpable. Not everyone was convinced, however. A group of white townsfolk near the back of the sanctuary exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man with graying hair and a stern expression, stood up abruptly. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice cutting through the rising tide of emotion. "You're talking about stirring up trouble in a town that's already hanging by a thread. You start a fight with the Iron Fangs, and it's not just you who'll pay the price, it's everyone." Ellie turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "I understand your fear," she said, "but tell me this. How much longer can we live like this? How much more are we willing to lose before we say enough is enough?" The man hesitated, his expression softening slightly. Before he could respond, another voice called out from the crowd. "She's right." It was Mrs. Turner, the elderly widow who had spoken at the last meeting. Her voice was steady despite her frail appearance. "We've been living under their thumb for too long. It's time we push back." Ellie seized the moment, her voice strong and clear. "Mrs. Turner is right. But this isn't just about pushing back. It's about standing together. The Iron Fangs want us divided because they know that's the only way they can win. But if we stand united, they don't stand a chance." As the meeting continued, Ellie outlined her plan. It wasn't a call to violence, but a call to action. The first step was to gather more information, proof of the gang's illegal activities, evidence that could be used to bring them down. She encouraged the attendees to keep their eyes and ears open, to document anything suspicious and report it to her team. Debbie and Richie volunteered to help coordinate the effort, using their military training to organize the information they collected. Sam, meanwhile, offered to provide security for the community. "We can't rely on the police," he said bluntly, "not when half of them are in the Fangs' pocket. But we can protect each other. If we work together, we can make this town safer, one street at a time." By the time the meeting ended, the mood in the church had shifted. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer the dominant force. In its place was a growing sense of determination, a quiet resolve to fight back against the darkness that had gripped Timberbrook for too long. As the crowd began to disperse, Ellie lingered near the door, thanking each person who stopped to speak with her. Some offered words of encouragement. Others shared tips and leads they thought might be useful. One man handed her a worn notebook, explaining that it contained detailed notes about the gang's movements over the past year. "I didn't know what to do with it before," he said, "but I think it'll do more good in your hands." Ellie nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you. This could make all the difference." When the church finally emptied, Ellie and her team gathered near the altar, reviewing the night's events. Marcus leaned against a pew, his arms crossed as he watched his mother with a mixture of pride and concern. "You really think this is going to work?" he asked. Ellie looked at him, her expression firm. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's a start, and sometimes that's all you need." Richie clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your mom's got the right idea, kid," he said. "This town might be a mess, but I've seen worse. And I've seen what happens when people like your mom decide to fight back. Things change." Marcus didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Outside the church, the night was quiet. The town's usual tension momentarily lifted. Ellie stood on the steps, looking out at the darkened streets. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. But as she turned to join her team, a folded piece of paper caught her eye, tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her truck. She unfolded it carefully, her stomach tightening as she read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "If you don't stop, we'll make sure you regret it." Ellie's jaw tightened, but she didn't let the note shake her. Instead, she tucked it into her pocket and walked back into the church where her team was waiting. The fight was far from over, but Ellie Carter wasn't about to back down. Chapter 5: Fire and Fury. The night was eerily silent, the type of quiet that prickled at the edges of Ellie's consciousness. She sat on the worn sofa in her living room, flipping through the notebook one of the townsfolk had given her earlier that day. Each page was filled with details about the Iron Fangs, their comings and goings, the locations of their so-called businesses, and the names of a few key players. The meticulousness impressed her, but it also made her uneasy. Whoever had compiled this information had been dangerously close to the gang's operations. Marcus sat across from her, scrolling through his phone and occasionally glancing toward the window. He hadn't said much since the meeting at the church, but Ellie could sense his growing unease. She could see it in the way his leg bounced, in the tight grip he kept on his phone, and in the way his eyes darted toward every small noise outside. "You should try to get some sleep," Ellie said, closing the notebook and setting it on the coffee table. Marcus scoffed. "How am I supposed to sleep, Mom? We're in their crosshairs now. That note they left on your truck wasn't a warning, it was a promise." Ellie leaned back, her expression calm despite the weight of his words. "We've been in their crosshairs since the day they burned your restaurant down. This isn't new, Marcus. We're just finally fighting back." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the front of the house. Both of them froze for half a second before the acrid smell of smoke hit their noses. Ellie jumped to her feet, her mind snapping into action. "Get out!" she shouted, grabbing Marcus's arm and pulling him toward the back door. Flames began to consume the living room, licking at the old curtains and creeping up the walls. Marcus hesitated, his gaze darting to a framed picture of his late father that sat on the mantel. "I can't leave it," he yelled, but Ellie tightened her grip on his arm. "There's no time," she shouted, dragging him through the kitchen and out the back door. They stumbled into the cool night air, coughing and gasping as smoke poured from the windows of their home. By the time the fire department arrived, the house was beyond saving. Ellie and Marcus stood in the front yard, watching helplessly as the flames consumed everything. Ellie's heart ached as she thought about the family photos, the keepsakes, the letters from her military days, all reduced to ash. The fire chief approached, his expression grim. "We'll do what we can, Ms. Carter, but it doesn't look good." Ellie nodded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I know. Just keep it from spreading to the neighbors' houses." As the firefighters worked, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the glow of the fire and the sound of sirens. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others stood silently, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. A few even stepped forward to offer help. Sarah Mitchell, an older white woman who lived 2 doors down, approached Ellie hesitantly. "Ellie, Sarah's voice faltered. "I don't know what to say. This is awful." Ellie turned to her, her expression hard but not unkind. "You don't need to say anything, Sarah. Just tell me something. Did you hear or see anything before it started?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes darting to the ground. "I didn't. I wish I had." Ellie sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Thanks anyway." As dawn broke, the fire was finally extinguished. All that remained of Ellie's home was a smoldering pile of rubble. She stood at the edge of the wreckage, her arms crossed and her face set in a grim mask. Marcus stood beside her, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is what they do," he said bitterly. "They destroy everything. And for what? To prove they can?" Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder. "They want us to give up," she said. "They want us to run, but we're not going to give them that satisfaction." Word of the fire spread quickly through Timberbrook. By mid-morning, Ellie and Marcus found themselves surrounded by a small group of townsfolk who had come to offer their support. Some brought food and clothing, while others offered words of encouragement. Even those who had previously kept their distance now seemed to understand the stakes. "You've got more people on your side than you think," said a young man named Jamal, one of the organizers of the newly formed neighborhood patrols. "We're not going to let them scare us anymore." Ellie nodded, a small spark of hope flickering to life within her. "Thank you," she said. "All of you. This isn't just about me or Marcus. It's about all of us. And if we're going to stand up to the Iron Fangs, we have to do it together." Later that day, Ellie and her team met at the church to regroup. The fire had shaken them, but it had also galvanized their resolve. Richie paced the length of the room, his hands jammed into his pockets. "This was a message," he said. "They're telling us to back off." "And we're not going to," Ellie replied firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't let them bait us into making a mistake." Debbie nodded. "Agreed. We need to focus on building our case against them. The more evidence we have, the harder it'll be for them to retaliate without exposing themselves." Sam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "I've been talking to some of the younger guys in the neighborhood patrols. They're ready to step up, but they need guidance. If we can organize them, we'll have a better chance of keeping everyone safe." Ellie considered this, then nodded. "Do it. And let's start working on getting those patrols more resources. Walkie-talkies, flashlights, whatever they need." Over the next few days, the mood in Timberbrook began to shift. The fire had been a turning point, a catalyst that brought the community closer together. People who had once been too afraid to speak out now stepped forward, sharing their stories and offering their help. Ellie's team worked tirelessly, gathering information, organizing patrols, and planning their next moves. But the Iron Fangs were not idle. They stepped up their intimidation tactics, patrolling the streets in broad daylight and targeting businesses that had shown support for Ellie and Marcus. Windows were smashed, graffiti was sprayed, and threats were made. Yet despite their efforts, the gang found it increasingly difficult to maintain their grip on the town. At one point, Richie intercepted a message from one of the gang's informants, a young man who had been coerced into working for them. The message hinted at a growing frustration within the Iron Fangs ranks. "They're losing control," Richie told Ellie. "They don't know how to handle a town that's not afraid of them anymore." One night, as Ellie sat on the steps of the church, she looked out at the town she had called home for decades. The scars left by the Iron Fangs were everywhere, but so too were the signs of resilience. People were coming together, fighting back against the fear that had kept them silent for so long. Ellie felt a sense of pride and determination that she hadn't felt in years. We're not done yet, she muttered to herself. Not by a long shot. As she stood to go back inside, Marcus approached, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. We're going to win this, Mom, he said. I can feel it. Ellie smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. We're going to win because we don't have a choice, she replied. This is our town, and we're not giving it up. Chapter 6. Iron Will Against Iron Fangs. The moon cast a faint glow over Timberbrook as Ellie sat with her team in the basement of the church, a space that had become their de facto war room. A map of the town stretched across the table, dotted with pins and notes marking suspected Iron Fangs locations. The air was heavy with determination, and the quiet hum of voices gave way to the sharp clarity of a plan taking shape. Ellie stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces of her allies. Samuel Hayes leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his sharp eyes betraying a mind constantly calculating. Deborah Johnson had a laptop open, its screen illuminating her determined expression as she typed notes. Richard Porter, or Richie as they called him, adjusted a camera in his lap, ensuring it was ready for their covert surveillance efforts. This is what we know, Ellie began, tapping the map with a steady hand. The Iron Fangs have 4 key locations. This garage here on Main Street is where they stash their supplies. The old warehouse on the edge of town is their main headquarters. And we've got reports of transactions happening at the gas station on Route 7. We also have reason to believe someone inside the sheriff's department is tipping them off. Richie shook his head in disgust. Figures. We've been wondering how they stay a step ahead. It's someone on the inside. Ellie nodded. Which means we can't go to the police, not yet. We need to gather enough evidence to go straight to the DEA. Debbie looked up from her screen. I've been combing through everything we've got so far. The connections are there, but we need something concrete. Photos, videos, and witnesses willing to talk. Samuel leaned forward, his voice low and steady. I've been working with the neighborhood patrols. We've got a few people who've seen the Fangs dealing drugs near the warehouse, but they're scared to come forward. They have every right to be, Ellie said, but fear won't win this fight. We need to protect them while we do our part. The next few nights were a blur of preparation. Richie and Sam coordinated surveillance efforts, setting up hidden cameras near known Iron Fangs locations. Marcus joined one of the patrols, walking the streets with other young men who had grown tired of living in fear. Ellie moved between the groups, offering guidance and encouragement while keeping the larger picture in mind. One evening, Richie returned from a surveillance run with footage that made the room buzz with energy. He played the video on Debbie's laptop, and the room fell silent as they watched. The grainy footage showed a group of Iron Fangs members unloading crates from a van outside the warehouse. One of them opened a crate, revealing bags of a white powdery substance. Another man handed over a stack of cash, his face partially illuminated by the dim light. This is it, Richie said, his voice tinged with excitement. This is the kind of evidence we need. Ellie nodded but remained cautious. It's a start, but it's not enough to bring them down. We need more. The breakthrough came a few nights later. Samuel, who had been leading a patrol near the gas station, intercepted a conversation between 2 Iron Fangs members. Using a recording device Ellie had given him, he captured their discussion about an upcoming deal involving a shipment of drugs and weapons. The deal was set to take place at the warehouse in 3 days. Midnight. Ellie gathered her team that night to finalize their plan. This is our chance, she said. We'll coordinate with the DEA to raid the warehouse, but we need to be there to ensure the evidence isn't destroyed. Debbie frowned. What about the insider at the sheriff's department? If they find out what we're planning... Ellie cut her off. That's why we're keeping this within our group. The fewer people who know, the better. The day of the raid arrived with a palpable tension. Ellie contacted a DEA agent she had served with during her time in the military. Agent Ramirez, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind, agreed to help, impressed by the thoroughness of Ellie's preparations. This isn't going to be easy, Ramirez warned as they met in a secluded spot outside of town. The Fangs are armed and dangerous. We'll have backup, but you need to stay out of the line of fire. Ellie met her gaze evenly. We'll do what we have to, but we're not standing down. As night fell, the group gathered near the warehouse. The DEA agents were positioned discreetly, waiting for Ellie's signal. Samuel and Richie monitored the scene from a safe distance, their radios crackling softly with updates. Ellie, Debbie, and Marcus stayed closer to the action, ready to move in once the raid began. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Ellie watched as the Iron Fangs gathered, their numbers larger than she had anticipated. Havoc, their leader, stood near the center of the group, barking orders and gesturing toward the crates being unloaded. Ellie took a deep breath and gave the signal. Now! The raid unfolded in a blur of movement and sound. DEA agents stormed the warehouse, shouting commands as they moved in with precision. The Iron Fangs fought back, their defiance as brutal as it was futile. Ellie and her team stayed on the outskirts, capturing footage and ensuring no one slipped away. Havoc, however, wasn't going down without a fight. As the DEA agents closed in, he grabbed a gun and made a run for it, heading straight for Ellie and Marcus. Ellie stepped forward, her hands steady as she aimed her own weapon. "Havoc!" she shouted. "It's over! Drop the gun!" He smirked, his eyes wild with defiance. "You think you've won, Carter? This town will never be yours." Ellie didn't flinch. "This town doesn't belong to you either. It belongs to the people who refuse to let fear rule them." Havoc raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Ellie shot first, hitting him in the shoulder. He fell to the ground, cursing and writhing in pain as DEA agents swarmed him. By the time the dust settled, the warehouse was secured and dozens of Iron Fangs members were in custody. The evidence Ellie and her team had gathered, combined with the DEA's seizure of drugs and weapons, was more than enough to ensure convictions. As the first rays of dawn broke over Timberbrook, Ellie stood outside the warehouse, watching as the last of the Fangs were loaded into police vans. Marcus approached, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," he said. Ellie nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did, but this is just the beginning." Chapter 7, Rebuilding Timberbrook. The air in Timberbrook was different now, filled with a tentative sense of possibility. For years, the Iron Fangs had gripped the town in a chokehold of fear, their power unchallenged, their violence unchecked. But with the gang dismantled and its leader Havoc behind bars, the town was no longer living in their shadow. Ellie Carter knew, however, that breaking free from fear was only the first step. Timberbrook had to rebuild, not just its physical structures, but its fractured soul. Ellie stood outside the charred remains of Marcus's southern kitchen, now little more than a scorched skeleton of what it had once been. The vibrant sign Marcus had painted with so much pride was gone, replaced by a plywood board spray-painted with the words, "Hope is stronger than fear." Marcus approached, his hands in his pockets, his face thoughtful. "I never thought I'd see the day they'd be gone," he said, "but looking at this, it feels like a hollow victory." Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hollow victories are only hollow if you stop here. This is the beginning, not the end." The first sign of change came from the community itself. A group of neighbors, including those who had once avoided eye contact with Ellie and Marcus, gathered to discuss how they could help. Sarah, the elderly woman who had apologized after Ellie's house was burned, was among the first to speak. "We've all been complicit in this, in some way or another," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Whether it was out of fear or ignorance, we let this happen. We let the Iron Fangs take our town. But Ellie and Marcus, they fought back when no one else would. The least we can do is help them rebuild." The meeting erupted in a chorus of agreement. People began volunteering their time, skills, and resources. Carpenters offered to help reconstruct the restaurant. Farmers promised to donate fresh produce for Marcus's kitchen once it reopened. Even those who had little to give found ways to contribute, from painting walls to cleaning debris. Ellie was hesitant to accept help from the former enemies of progress, but Marcus encouraged her. "Mom, this isn't just about us anymore," he said. "It's about the whole town coming together. If we don't let them help, they'll never change." One by one, volunteers arrived. Richie used his skills as a mechanic to repair the restaurant's damaged appliances. Debbie organized a fundraiser at the church, her charisma drawing in a crowd from all corners of Timberbrook. Sam coordinated the logistics, ensuring materials and labor were used efficiently. The site buzzed with energy and activity, a testament to what the town could accomplish when united. As the restaurant began to take shape, Ellie turned her attention to the young people of Timberbrook. Many of them had grown up under the Iron Fangs' rule, their futures stunted by the gang's influence. Some of them, former members of the gang, approached Ellie with trepidation, unsure if they would be welcomed. One of them, a wiry young man named Darnell, stepped forward nervously. "Miss Ellie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I used to run with them, the Fangs. I didn't want to, but I didn't see another way. I want to do better. I want to make things right." Ellie studied him for a moment before speaking. "Doing better starts with showing up," she said. "If you're serious about turning things around, I'll help you, but you have to put in the work." Darnell nodded, his eyes full of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ellie enlisted Richie and Sam to mentor Darnell and others like him. Richie taught them practical skills like auto repair, while Sam introduced them to discipline and teamwork through fitness and self-defense training. Debbie provided counseling, helping them process the trauma and guilt they carried. Meanwhile, Marcus's Southern Kitchen became a symbol of Timberbrook's transformation. As word spread about the rebuilding efforts, donations began pouring in from neighboring towns and former residents who had left Timberbrook behind. Marcus was moved by the support, but stayed focused on his goal. "This restaurant isn't just about food," he said during a town meeting. "It's about preserving our history, our culture. It's about showing the world that we're more than what they've painted us to be." The opening day of the rebuilt Southern Kitchen was set for the following month, and the entire town was abuzz with anticipation. Ellie watched as Marcus poured his heart into every detail, from the menu to the decor. He insisted on incorporating elements that reflected the town's diverse history, including photographs of Timberbrook's early settlers and a mural honoring the workers who had rebuilt the restaurant. As Timberbrook came together to celebrate its rebirth, Ellie noticed subtle but profound changes in the community. People who had once been divided by fear and prejudice began to reach out to one another. A white business owner who had previously refused to serve Ellie approached her after a town meeting. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I see now that ignoring the problem only made it worse. I want to do better. For you, for the town." Ellie nodded, her expression softened by a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "but it starts with conversations like this." Ellie also found herself reflecting on her own growth. For years, she had lived on the fringes of Timberbrook, keeping her head down and avoiding conflict. But the events of the past months had reignited the fire within her, reminding her of the courage and resilience that had carried her through her military service. One evening, as she sat on the porch of her rebuilt home, she thought about the journey ahead. Timberbrook was on the path to healing, but there was still much work to be done. The scars left by the Iron Fangs would take time to fade, and the town's deeper issues of inequality and mistrust required ongoing attention. The grand reopening of Marcus's Southern Kitchen was a turning point. The restaurant was packed with locals and visitors alike, all eager to celebrate what the town had achieved. Ellie watched with pride as Marcus moved through the crowd, shaking hands and sharing stories. The mural on the wall, painted by a local artist, depicted scenes of resilience and hope. Families rebuilding homes, neighbors helping neighbors, and a bright sunrise over Timberbrook. During the evening, Marcus took a moment to address the crowd. "This restaurant stands because of all of you," he said. "It's a reminder that we're stronger together. Timberbrook isn't perfect, but today we've proven that we're willing to fight for a better future." The room erupted in applause, and Ellie felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, Timberbrook felt like a place of promise. As the night wound down, Ellie stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The streets of Timberbrook, once patrolled by the Iron Fangs, now felt safe and welcoming. She spotted Darnell and a group of former gang members, now wearing shirts that read "Community Watch." They waved at her, their faces bright with pride. "You've done good, Miss Ellie," Darnell said, approaching her. "You've given us a second chance." Ellie smiled. "You earned it. Now don't waste it." As she walked back into the restaurant, she felt the weight of the past lifting. Timberbrook was far from perfect, but it was no longer trapped in fear. The people had found their voices, and together, they were building something worth fighting for. Chapter 8. The Light Beyond the Shadows. The morning sun crept over Timberbrook, casting long rays of light onto streets that had seen decades of division and fear, but were now alive with renewal. Ellie Carter sat on the porch of her rebuilt home, the fresh wood of the steps still fragrant with the smell of pine. In her hand, she cradled a cup of coffee, its steam curling into the cool air. She watched as people, both familiar and surprising faces, milled about in preparation for the day's ceremony. Today, Timberbrook would celebrate not just the defeat of the Iron Fangs, but the resilience of its people and their commitment to a brighter future. Ellie's gaze wandered to Marcus, standing near the restored southern kitchen. He was supervising a group of volunteers setting up tables laden with food: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and sweet tea. She could hear his laughter ring out as he cracked jokes with the group, his energy infectious. The restaurant had become more than a symbol. It was the heart of a new Timberbrook. She turned back to the street, where a young man wearing a bright orange vest passed by, carrying a bag of tools. Ellie recognized him immediately. Darnell, the former Iron Fangs member who had sought her guidance. He noticed her, paused, and offered a shy wave before continuing toward a playground where a group of children played. Ellie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't just the buildings and businesses being rebuilt, it was the people themselves. As the ceremony began, the church bells rang out, drawing a crowd to the small square in the center of town. Chairs had been set up in neat rows, with a podium standing beneath a canopy of string lights. The townspeople, who had once been fractured by fear and mistrust, now gathered as one. Ellie took her seat in the front row, flanked by Marcus and her closest allies, Samuel, Richie, and Debbie. Each of them wore expressions of quiet pride, knowing that the road to this moment had been long and fraught with hardship. Pastor Franklin, a tall man with a commanding voice, stepped up to the podium. Today, he began, we gather not just to celebrate what we have overcome, but to honor the courage of those who led us here. Timberbrook is no stranger to hardship, but today we prove that no amount of hate or violence can extinguish the light of hope. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat as Pastor Franklin gestured toward her. One woman in particular stood at the forefront of this fight. Ellie Carter, your strength, your bravery, and your refusal to back down have inspired us all. Please join me at the podium. Ellie rose, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way to the stage. As she stood before the microphone, she took a moment to scan the crowd. There were familiar faces, neighbors who had once kept their distance, now smiling and nodding, and new ones, people who had come to Timberbrook to be part of its transformation. When I came back to this town after my time in the service, Ellie began, her voice steady, I thought I was returning to a place where I could find peace. Instead, I found a town weighed down by fear, divided by hatred, and ruled by violence. For years, I kept my head down, thinking that silence would protect me and my family. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't bring peace. It only allows injustice to thrive. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. It wasn't until my son Marcus decided to open his restaurant that I realized change was possible. He reminded me that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about standing up despite it. And when the Iron Fangs came for us, when they burned down his dream, we didn't run. We stood together. And because of that, Timberbrook stands today as a town transformed. The applause was thunderous, and Ellie felt a tear slip down her cheek as Marcus stepped forward to hug her. Together, they unveiled a plaque mounted near the restaurant's entrance. It read, Marcus's Southern Kitchen, built by a community for a community. The ceremony continued with speeches from others who had played pivotal roles in Timberbrook's transformation. Richie recounted the moments when he had doubted whether the town could change. I've seen the worst in people, he admitted, but I've also seen the best. Ellie showed me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself, and now it's our turn to keep that fight alive. Debbie spoke next, her voice steady but full of emotion. I've worked in places where life feels disposable, where people are forgotten, she said, but Timberbrook has proven that no one is beyond redemption. We all have a role to play in lifting each other up. Samuel's words were simple but heartfelt. The battles we fight today, he said, will shape the Timberbrook our children inherit tomorrow, and I'll be damned if we leave them anything less than a town worth living in. As the day turned into evening, the festivities continued. The square buzzed with activity, children laughing as they chased each other around the tables, adults sharing food and conversation, and musicians playing a mix of gospel and blues on a makeshift stage. Ellie sat back, watching it all with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. One moment stood out to her. A young boy, no more than 7, approached her with a shy smile. He held out a crayon drawing of a sunrise beneath which he had written, "Thank you, Miss Ellie." Ellie knelt down to accept the drawing. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice catching. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy replied. "My mom said you helped us, so I wanted to make you something." Ellie hugged him, her heart full. "Thank you, Daniel. This means the world to me." As the celebration wound down, Ellie found herself back on her porch, joined by Marcus, Richie, Debbie, and Samuel. The group sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of laughter and music still faintly audible from the square. "It feels different now," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "The town, I mean. It's not just the buildings, it's the people." Ellie nodded. "Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. And we've proven that we're capable of more than we ever thought." Richie leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. "Who would have thought Timberbrook could come this far? But you know, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Debbie raised her glass in a toast. "To Timberbrook, to courage, and to the people who refuse to give up." The others echoed her sentiment, their glasses clinking together as the first stars appeared in the night sky. In the days that followed, the impact of Timberbrook's transformation rippled beyond the town itself. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the community's resilience and the leadership of Ellie and her allies. Messages of support poured in, and the town became a symbol of what was possible when people came together to confront injustice. For Ellie, however, the most meaningful moments were the small ones. The smiles exchanged between neighbors who had once been strangers, the laughter of children who no longer had to grow up in fear, and the knowledge that Timberbrook was finally a place where hope could thrive. One morning as she sat on her porch, a familiar figure walked by. It was Darnell, now wearing the uniform of Timberbrook's community patrol. He stopped, tipped his hat, and said, "Thank you, Miss Ellie, for everything." Ellie smiled, her gaze following him as he continued down the street. She thought about all the battles they had fought, all the obstacles they had overcome. Timberbrook wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A town rebuilt on courage, unity, and the unwavering belief that light could always find its way through the shadows. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Ellie knew with certainty that Timberbrook's best days were still ahead. In the face of fear, she chose to fight. Ellie's story isn't just about revenge, it's about courage, resilience, and standing tall when the world tries to break you. What would you have done in her shoes? Who would you call when the fight gets personal? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice matters. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more powerful tales, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of what true strength looks like. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story that proves heroes come in all forms.